You are listening to the Wool Academy podcast. This is episode number 11. Hello and welcome. My name is Elisabeth van Delden, and once a week we talk to an industry expert from the wool industry supply chain from farm to fashion and beyond, delivering strategies and insights to be successful in wool and showcasing those beautiful stories wool has to tell. Today we welcome Roy Kettlewell on the show. Roy worked in the wool industry for over 43 years and today he runs his own consulting business. At Kettlewell Consulting, Roy applies his many years of knowledge in areas of product and process development, chemical finishing, knitwear and fabric finishing, as well as training and education. Welcome, Roy. It's so great to talk to you today.
Oh, hello. Nice to talk to you as well, Elisabeth.
I know you've been so busy lately and it took us some time to arrange for today's meeting. So tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do in the wool industry.
Okay, so you may have spotted already that I'm from the north of England. I worked there for many years as a technologist for the Woolmark company, whilst I was at their development centre in Ilkley in West Yorkshire. Now, this development centre was a fantastic location and a fantastic establishment because it was there that I got to learn about the entire wool processing pipeline, right from the raw fibre through to the finished garment. And I found out what you can actually do with wool to make it amazing and also to make it relevant for the modern world. From Ilkley, I was lucky because I was able to travel all over the world working with manufacturers, retailers, and introducing to them the new technologies that we developed in Ilkley.
And I think today you call Australia your home. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm still lucky. I get to live in the wonderful city of Sydney. Beautiful climate. We've just experienced 30 centigrade today, and it's a great place to bring up your family and just live. Wonderful.
Yeah, maybe a little bit better weather than in the north of England, I gather.
Just a bit.
Yeah. And tell me, what made you so passionate about wool? Like, what gave you that spark to stay so long in the wool industry?
I suppose over time, with working with wool, I started to realise it was a rather special fibre. It's been, essentially, it's been designed by nature to protect the animals that it covers, and this protection, this design is so clever. It's by nature. And that same protection and cleverness, it can also be transferred to us as humans if we wear the correct garments.
Yeah, and I understood from your introduction that you now run your own consultancy business. So how do you help companies in particular?
Well, I set up Kettlewell Consulting after I left the Woolmark company, Australian Wool Innovation, because I didn't actually want all of the knowledge and experience that I'd acquired over the years to be wasted. When you think about it, the wool growers in Australia in particular have invested an awful lot in me, and it would be a pity not to continue using that to the overall benefit of the wool industry. And in this consulting business, I try and focus on the 3 T's of textiles. Technology transfer, that's actually 2 T's, but really I'm only thinking in one here. Training, education, and of course troubleshooting. So those 3, let's say, legs are the ones that support Kettlewell Consulting.
Yeah, and I agree because today you will also be sharing a lot of your knowledge with us, which I'm very thankful for. But before we maybe go into more technical questions, maybe let us also know a little bit who would be like your typical customer of Kettlewell Consulting.
Well, I suppose my customers come from all over the wool industry. I'm currently working with brands and retailers in the US. I'm working with machinery manufacturers in the UK, and then the fabric makers and yarn spinners um, in China and India. Essentially, anyone who is looking for help in wool textiles, I'm very happy to work with. This sounds like a plug for Kettlewell Consulting, of course, but as I mentioned earlier on, I really do want to be able to help the industry use wool as easily as possible.
Yeah, and that customer base also explains why you have been traveling quite a bit over the last few months.
Yes, I did almost a round the world trip. I visited China, then the UK, then America, back to the UK, and then back home. So it was quite an extensive set of visits, but
Yeah.
very interesting. And one thing about this business I've learned over the years is that once you get away from your desk and off the phone and face to face, it just becomes so much more interesting.
Yeah, and also it shows how international and connected the wool industry is on a global scale.
It certainly does.
Yeah,
Yes,
which also makes, I think, the work very fascinating at the same time.
it does. Yes.
Yeah. So now let's get into some of the technical questions. And my next question is actually kind of a question that has been bugging me, or that I'm quite feel in the dark, because when it comes to the wool processing supply chain, I do understand the process of spinning, and I also understand the process of weaving. And obviously, at some point, the wool also often gets dyed. But kind of a gray area for me has always been the finishing process. And maybe that's quite embarrassing for me to admit, but this is how it is. So maybe can you explain what different finishing processes exist and what exactly happens?
Uh, Right. Well, your reference to a grey area is actually almost a pun, because we often refer to the unfinished material that comes from the weaving loom or from the knitting machine as grey goods. So you've made me an easy introduction to this topic, because we start with the grey goods, and the ultimate aim of the finishing process is essentially to remove the residual oils and contaminants that may have been used in the spinning and the weaving of the fibre. And then once you've removed those, it's really about developing the desired handle, the texture, and also to ensure that the fabric and ultimately the garment are dimensionally stable, especially for the maker up, but also in wearing and caring of the garment. So, in order to get to this this final stage, the finished goods, as it were, we have to think in terms of three main stages, and this applies both to knitwear and to fabrics. Those three stages essentially are preparation, the wet processing, and then the dry processing. Now, just to go into a little bit more detail, the preparation, it's really about making sure that when we wet the fabric in scouring, we don't end up creasing or distorting the materials, because it's that wet stage that has one of the greatest influences on the wool fibre. And the reason for this is that the wool fibre has a surprisingly important relationship with water, more so than most of the fibres. And this is because the wool fibre is what we refer to as hygroscopic. And what this means is that wool can actually absorb moisture vapour, not necessarily liquid moisture like water, but moisture vapor like steam or just the moisture from the atmosphere. In fact, we know that wool can absorb up to a third of its own weight in moisture without actually feeling wet. Now, as it absorbs this moisture, the wool fibre changes. It changes from a relatively solid and resilient material to a relatively plastic material that stretches and bends more easily. Now, what this means is that once we get the fibre damp, we can pull the fibres out during the so-called milling and raising operations that make a hairy fabric. So that enables us to get something that's nice and thick and great for keeping us warm in winter. Or we can actually flatten the fabric in a steaming operation where the wool's absorbing even more moisture, and during that steaming operation we can flatten the fabric, make it smooth, make it thin, and this makes it ideal for summer wear fabrics because the fabric becomes thin. So what this means is that we've got an incredibly versatile fibre. It just depends on how you finish it. You can finish it to make it thick and warm, or you can finish it to make it smooth and cool. So just to sort of go back and list the, let's say, your 5 main processes in that operation, I would say they are preparation, which would be something like a process called crabbing. We've got the scouring and milling stage, which is wet, and that removes some of the contaminants and also develops some of the thickness if you require it. And then we've got processes like raising to pull even more fibres out of the fabric. Believe it or not, we then actually give the fabric a haircut. It's a process called cropping or shearing, but that basically is to remove unwanted hairiness or simply make the hairiness look a lot neater. Finally, we make sure the fabric is fully relaxed by giving it some steam so that the garment maker doesn't have any problems with it. And maybe if we're going to make the fabric nice and smooth and shiny for a beautiful worsted suit, we go through a process called pressing. Now, the quick-witted amongst you probably realise I've just mentioned about 5 or 6, but this is one of my passions, so I get a little bit carried away. But in many ways, of course, everything is connected in the manufacturing. The choice of fibre has a great influence on how it will finish. The choice of yarn count and the choice of yarn twist has a big influence on how the fabric is finished. But in my opinion, it's where the true, let's say, character of a fabric is developed. In spinning and weaving, you've got a latent character that's waiting to be released. In finishing, we do that, and that's where we develop the true characteristics of a wool fabric. It's almost an art form.
Yeah, well, it definitely sounds like that. So thank you so much for summarizing all of that. And I just want to clarify one thing. You said during the scouring process, we get rid of the contamination. And I think the word contamination sometimes has a different meaning to other people, more of like, contaminants like chemicals that are dangerous. But in the wool world, I think contamination, we think more about little I think burrs and stuff like that gets washed out.
It can be several things. First of all, during the early stages of spinning, we apply oils and lubricants to help the spinning process. Maybe it's similar during weaving. These chemicals need to be removed. They're readily soluble in water. And also you mentioned the burrs and the seeds and the grasses that sometimes are present in the fabric. Again, we have to remove those, otherwise they show up as black spots or even as white spots in a dark fabric. So they're contamination, but not in the nasty chemical sense
Exactly.
of contamination.
Yeah. No, thanks for clarifying that. And at some point, you also quickly mentioned caring for wool products,
Yes.
and one of I guess finishing processes is what we call the easy care treatment. What is that exactly?
Well, easy care is a term that's used a lot, not just in textiles, but it quite often is. And it's not just about wool. You can have easy care cotton shirts, easy care chinos, easy care just about anything. Wool is not alone. There's always been a desire to be able to care for wool easily. There is a kind of a myth that wool is difficult to care for, and I think that's because we often see wool as being difficult to wash. History is littered with consumers who have made a mistake and put the wrong type of garment in the washing machine, or used the wrong washing cycle, or even the wrong detergent, and ended up with a garment that changed shape, changed colour, or even all three. In the case of garments that have shrunk out of possible use. So to avoid this possibility, and in a way destroy the myth that wool's difficult to care for, an awful lot of work has been carried out over the last 50 or 60 years, even before I started, to avoid this particular situation. And what all of this work has resulted in is special treatments that can be applied either to the fibre in the top form, or to the fabric, woven fabric, or even to the garment. Special treatments that will render the garment in the consumer's hands suitable for machine washing. This type of process now is very well established. There's many companies around the world that offer machine washable, even machine wash tumble dry products. So essentially there's no real need for today's consumer to be concerned about caring for their wool garment. Of course, they have to look at the care label and make sure that it is actually suitable for the washing machine. Normally a retailer makes many of these decisions. They actually specify machine washable products because they know that their consumer is likely to want to put their particular product in a washing machine. So that could be things like socks, underwear, for example, sportswear, and of course children's wear. These products essentially almost have to be machine washable. Other garments, like a man's suit, for example, or a lady's suit, maybe not so important to machine wash. Of course, you can make machine washable suits and jackets and trousers, but the consumer demand for those is less. Consumers generally understand that such a garment will likely be dry cleaned.
Yeah, I think I had a lot of friends complaining to me that they have by accident shrunk one of their favorite sweaters in the washing machine.
I've even done it myself.
Yeah, true. I think I have to. Yeah, no, so that's great that products are being developed more in that direction where the consumer has it much easier to take care of those wool products. And another area I wanted to talk to you about is, and maybe that's also kind of a gray area, product testing. Like, what is important to look out for when, like, let's say a designer has developed a new product range, including wool, and they want to test those garments before they launch them. So what would be included in product testing?
This, Elisabeth, is a really important area. It's very important for easy care because you have to be sure that the garment is actually going to perform in the washing machine. Personally, I don't actually carry out any product testing, although I used to do when I first started my career. My job now is mostly about advising clients on the best types of tests or series of tests to carry out in order to make sure that it's actually suitable for the end use. And sometimes the testing I advise upon is designed to help them investigate the reasons why the garment or the product isn't performing quite the way one expected it to. There's so many different tests in the textile business, so I'm not going to bore you with a long list of them. But one thing I will say is that most of the testing is actually based on what the consumer is expecting or the consumer experience. So, for example, an important test which is critical is the composition. If the label says the garment is 100% pure wool, then the garment really should be 100% wool. The garment should also not change colour significantly during its life. Now, that could be just through exposure to light or maybe through the cleaning cycles. Another important series of tests are associated with dimensional stability. Now, I know I've talked already about machine washing, but you've got to make sure the garment will be dimensionally stable even to dry cleaning or maybe hand washing. A very important series of tests. And then probably the final group is about how the garment actually performs in its wear life. Examples of this are the strengths of the seams. You don't want the seams to pull apart. The way the fabric wears, if it falls into holes very quickly, then that could be an issue. So we test things like abrasion resistance. And then, of course, there's always the issue of something called pilling, which the consumer probably more often recognises as with the term bobbling. But this is a perennial problem, not just with wool. In fact, wool quite often is considered reasonably, immune to pilling. But of course, there are circumstances where garments do pill, especially if the consumers worn them in a particularly, difficult or intensive way. So just to sum up there, it's about fibre content, colour change, dimensional stability and performance in wear. Those are really what enables the manufacturers, the retailers to predict how the garment will perform in the hands of the consumer.
Okay, wow, that was a really good overview. Thank you for that. Maybe we also can note those points down in the show notes, so then people listening can also go back to them and get those overview. Yes. I'll make sure we'll do that. And as you are traveling so much and visiting so many manufacturers, can you tell us a little bit about new and upcoming innovations or technologies that enable manufacturers to create new wool fabrics or knitwear? Like, are there any certain trends in the market? What can you share with us today?
I always, try and think of the innovations and the new, let's say, concept as being driven by consumer trends rather than the opposite. For merino wool, I'm still seeing the effects of the global financial crisis. Probably we'll see some effects of the Brexit and maybe even the American, election. But what this means is that consumers still desire value and they also desire products still with a touch of luxury. Just because they can't afford it doesn't mean to say that they don't desire it. I also see a lot of interest in extra performance, and this is to some extent associated with value, but I'm here thinking of things like durable water repellency, moisture management, anti-static, those sort of finishes, let's say extra properties that make the consumer much more interested in the wool product. It may be that these are essential performance attributes. Certainly moisture management is an important attribute in sportswear, for example. The third major trend, and this, to be honest, is another long-term trend, and that is the trend from a more formal look to a more casual one. And this obviously has a major impact on wool's major let's say product market, which is that of suits, formal jackets, formal trousers. What we're seeing is more and more interest in wearing casual items, even for the office. I'm sure you've seen, Elisabeth, over the last 10, 15 years, much more casual attire in the office, so-called casual Fridays, which are very common in Australia. You still look smart, but you don't go to work in a 3 or 2-piece suit. So, fortunately, all of these trends, these can be easily addressed by some of the new innovations in wool. For example, we have a process called mercerized merino. And what this does is gives wool a cashmere touch or a silk appearance at something like a third of the normal price of the cashmere or silk fibre. So what this means is that you can still get the luxury touch, but the product is within the grasp of the less affluent GFC tainted consumer. We also are able to create wool jersey fabrics that can deal with not just moisture vapor, which I've already talked about, but also deal with liquid moisture and get it away from the skin through to the outside of the garment. Now, this has a major impact on wool's suitability for sportswear, especially base layer garments where the consumer is very active, sweating, and needing to move lots of moisture away from the body in order to stay comfortable. And then we've got, for the more casual look, we're able to actually dye wool in a very similar way to the way that cotton is dyed. Essentially what that means is that we can dye wool so that it will fade during industrial washing, or even fade whilst the consumer's using it. And what that fading of the colour does is create this vintage or this aged look, which helps project this casual appearance, very similar to cotton. So we can, in a way, we can copy cotton, but when you do that, you don't end up with a precise cotton copy. You end up with a really elegant fabric that just happens, to have a faded appearance. So easy to create elegant casual looks, which work really well on so-called casual or dress-down Fridays.
Yeah, and you just mentioned these different areas like the sports area, the casual area. And do you see that wool is being used in kind of new and different markets more and more? Do you see certain trends?
Well, yes. I mean, if you visit the sports exhibitions, and I'm sure you've been to one or two of these over the years, Elisabeth, what you'll see at shows like ISPO, shows like Outdoor Retail, and so on, is nearly all the major sports brands and the manufacturers, even the likes of Nike, Adidas, who you don't traditionally associate with wool, they all offer a premium range that includes wool. And the reason for this is really that slowly but surely the sportswear industry is waking up to the fact that wool is actually the ideal fibre for sportswear. It's got inherent moisture management properties. It's got inherent cooling and also thermal properties, depending on how the fabric is constructed. And also, it's really good at managing odour. One of the major issues for sports garments, I think, is their tendency to, for want of a better phrase, become smelly after you've worn them a while, even after you've just worn them once. Naturally the body creates sweat. Naturally the bacteria on the skin decomposes that sweat and creates smelly molecules. Now, the most common way of dealing with that is to kill the bacteria with some sort of antimicrobial finish. Now, that's fine, but really it's not quite the natural way of dealing with it. Wool, on the other hand, has this chemical structure that actually can absorb some of those smelly molecules, and it actually locks them away. So when you've been exercising, you've perspired, the garment becomes wet, but the bacteria on your skin still does what it always has done, and what it prefers to do is to try and decompose that sweat. But the smelly molecules, they're absorbed by the wool fibre. So that garment doesn't smell. And the remarkable thing about the wool fibre is that it can absorb a surprising amount of smelly molecules. It's feasible to do some really tough exercise, and we've done this in various wear trials. Do some exercise, leave the garment in your sports bag overnight, pull it out in the morning, and it doesn't smell. Wear it again. Do the same again, and you can do this multiple times. Now, what this means is that this garment, this wool garment that you're wearing next to the skin, doesn't need to be washed quite so often. Now, that has a positive environmental impact. So instead of washing the garment, every time you've worn it, you can get away with washing it maybe only after 4 or 5 wears. Now, of course, I know some of the listeners will, balk at the idea of not washing their sports garments, but I implore them to actually try. See if you, can avoid washing your garments after sports activities every time. Try wearing the wool one for an extra time, and you'll be amazed. It doesn't smell when you pull it out of the bag. Of course, you've got to take some showers in between. If you're if you haven't showered for a few weeks, then that will be a tough thing to deal with. But I'm assuming that your listeners are going to be reasonably hygienic, and you don't need to wash your wool garments quite so often.
Yeah, and I think also just think of how useful that is when you're traveling and you might want to, do some sports while you're traveling, but then you
Yes,
don't want to take that many sports garments with you. So that's also where this
it
can
works very well.
be applied. Yeah.
Now, the other potential new market for wool, I think, is the baby wear market. Now, Baby wear, of course, it needs to be machine washable. But over the last few years, because of the sports wear market's interest in wool jersey, which is ideal for base layer garments, these fine wool jerseys made from merino wool are also ideal for baby wear. So what we're seeing is more and more baby wear manufacturers starting to introduce wool jersey garments into their ranges. Now, again, some of your listeners will say, oh, my baby would not be comfortable wearing wool next to the skin. It will bring the baby out in a rash. The skin is far too delicate. Well, all I can say is pop on the internet, Google Ann Geddes, and have a look at the videos of her shooting pictures of babies wrapped in wool. It's quite remarkable. What you see there is not just happy babies, but babies that fall asleep in wool. If wool was such a prickly, uncomfortable fibre, this would never happen. So I think for baby wear, fine merino wool is, let's say, one of an unfortunate circumstance of being a well-kept secret. And I hope over the next few years, that myth that wool's not suitable for babies is well and truly debunked.
Yeah, no, I agree. And all of my friends who've had babies, they were gifted woolen garments, and all those babies seem to be very, very happy. So, yeah, it is, I think, apparent in the research and in practical life as well that wool is very good for babies. Well, maybe let's kind of come to a close, but I would like to ask you one question, maybe also for those designers and product development people who are listening to the show. Because wool is it's a natural product, so not every wool is the same because it's grown on sheep, and so it varies a lot. And I think it's quite overwhelming for designers to pick the right wool, and what we heard today is also it's quite important to be really decisive on what you want to achieve. So maybe can you summarize for someone who's looking to develop a wool product, what should they be really clear about before they go to their fabric or knitwear supplier?
Yes, it is actually fairly straightforward. You need to think about what the consumer is expecting from the product, and then you can work back from there. And you can think in terms of three basic product types. First of all, outerwear, like a sweater or a coat. Mid-layer, for example, a sweater, and then base layer, which would be, maybe the underwear or the sports garment. For these base layer garments, the most important attribute is the micron, or the thickness of the fibre. The finer the wool, the more comfortable the garment will be next to the skin. Now, it's important to have the wool next to the skin in these garments because it's next to the skin that the merino fibre can, do its wonderful moisture management trick. And if you think about it, on the sheep, the wool is next to the skin. And it's on the sheep, it's doing its job, and it's keeping the sheep alive, even in the hottest climates and even in the coolest climates. For mid-layer, the most important attribute really is the thickness of the fabric, because usually mid-layer garments are worn to keep you warm. So I'm thinking now of the type of sweater that would be worn, let's say, whilst hill walking. You need something thick and hairy, and so that means that a type of a woolen spun Aran type sweater maybe. But of course, if you're in an office or simply walking to work, a mid-layer garment might be finer, and it might be a 12 gauge worsted spun product, for example. When it comes to outerwear, really here you're talking about a degree of protection from the elements, like rain and wind, but also protection from the temperature as well. So, for outerwear, we're thinking in terms of it might be a jacket or trouser that makes you look smart, or it could be a coat to keep you warm. Here, I'm talking about worsted and woolen spun. The worsted, the smooth, fine yarns would be good in a suit, whereas the woolen spun, thicker, hairier yarns make a good coat, which is thicker and designed to keep you warm. So, the designer really needs to focus on the consumer and and think about what that garment has to do. And then that kind of really, dictates the type of wool, the type of finish maybe, or the type of yarn that will be required.
Okay, and
Does that
then
make sense?
yeah, and then whoever your fabric supplier would help you as well finding the right fabric for your product.
Yes, of course, some fabric suppliers are better at worsted spun fabrics, the fine, smooth ones, and other suppliers will be better for, thicker woolen spun, fabrics. But, that's the sort of thing that Kettlewell Consulting can help with. I know lots of manufacturers, and, I can, help people get in touch with the right suppliers for the best, let's say, product for the end use.
Oh, well, that's very good. And we'll make sure to also link to your website in our show notes as well. And maybe just one little wrap up question, because we did talk about a lot of, innovations and also different finishing processes to remove barriers for the consumers, like the easy care. But what do you think is the biggest barrier that we face in the wool industry in order for wool to be used even more in final garments?
Well, I hope that you don't have too many retailers as listeners to this podcast, but I'm tempted to say the biggest barrier is the retailer. Because it's the retailer that really specifies the fibre that will be used in a garment, and therefore controls what the consumer buys. Of course, if the consumer likes a garment for its value, comfort, etc., they'll repurchase, but they have to see it on the shelf in the first place. So if a retailer or brand cannot actually see a way to justify the invariably higher price for an equivalent wool product, then that wool product will never actually see the retail shelf. So the first thing the retailer needs to understand is the benefits and the value in the wool product. And this is where AWI's wool appreciation training courses come in. These help the retailer, not just the shop floor staff, but the back end buyers, merchandisers, and QA people actually understand more about wool, how to specify it, but essentially how to talk about it. Because it's the conversion of that knowledge into the benefits and into a marketing story to tell the consumer why they should buy it that makes the ultimate success of the wool product on the shelf. So sometimes retailers need marketing support in terms of dollars, but actually often really what they need is help just to formulate the right message. And again, that's something that I've been doing for many years now, working for the company.
Yeah, no, I think that all comes down again to how important communications is and education about wool.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we've got to educate the retailer so that they can educate the consumer.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that's also why I started this podcast, because I felt there's so much to learn about wool and so many nice stories that we just need to tell. So thank you so much, Roy, for taking the time to be on the Wool Academy podcast today. And I think you delivered so many insights and so much useful information. That was really great. Thank you for that.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Elisabeth, and I hope your listeners come away with at least one or two new ideas about wool that will inspire them perhaps to look at it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll make sure we'll note down all the different aspects you mentioned today in the show notes. And where can people reach you if they wanted to connect with you?
Well, they've got several choices. I'm on Skype, I'm on LinkedIn, I've got an email address, but you can get all of this off my website, kettlewellconsulting.com.
Perfect.
And so I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. So thank you once again. I think it's already late in the evening in Sydney, and I wish you a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for your time.
Okay, Elisabeth, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to me for all this time.
It was a pleasure as well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode with Roy Kettlewell. You can find out more about Roy in the show notes by visiting elisabethvandelden.com/011. Once again, elisabethvandelden.com/011. Don't want to miss out on any of the future episodes? Then subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, and also like us on Facebook at Elisabeth Van Delden. Thank you, and see you next week.